The room was only dimly lit by numerous bluish monitors, lined up next to each other and filling some walls. Two beings with gray skin and long arms were observing an image on the largest central monitor. An animal from the planet they were currently attacking lived in the waters of that large blue sphere and appeared on the screen. The image displayed it with the description and classification labeled as fish. The classification was written in the peculiar language of that race in unknown symbols. A zoom had been performed on its caudal fin, which they had spent some time trying to examine more closely, until it finally expanded and revealed its entire appearance in a robust body, a huge mouth, and sharp teeth. Something extended from its head, like a long, flexible filament, rising upward and then curving just in front of its face. At the tip of this filament, a glow emitted.
"Elysium,"
one of the beings said to his companion with a hissing voice.
"The bioluminescence at its tip serves as bait to attract smaller prey, and it hides in the abyssal depths. It's as if it's fishing for its victims. Isn't it fascinating? And also ironic?"
"In the depths of this enormous ocean, as they call it," the other said, emphasizing the word which still sounded completely strange to him, and left him in an uneasy posture. He imagined the vastness of what was gradually invading his mind. He continued, "Isn't it intriguing that humans have this living right beside them?" His fingers were on his chin.
"Certainly it is, Trognor. So weak are the humans, but so terrifying is this monster. It's a threat, but soon it won't be any more,"
he said, leaving his face somewhat rigid. "And does Agnek know about this?" the oddly appearing being with gray skin and a black cloak asked. He had only one eye and was completely identical to his companion, except he was stronger and larger. The two were sitting side by side.
"Agnek has never seen an ocean up close before, Trognor. Just like none of us have. What a foolish question."
And that peculiar being rolled his large singular eye, tilting his head back and letting out a long sigh. Then he moved to another monitor and began to type quickly on his respective computer. After a few commands, another image appeared on the main monitor. The majestic ocean they referred to emerged, clearly showing its different layers.
"The collected data indicates that the deeper you go, the less sunlight penetrates, the temperature becomes lower, and the pressure increases. At the surface, enough light still enters for photosynthesis, but the deeper you explore, the twilight becomes more intense until complete darkness, where the only light wandering is from those very creatures,"
he said, zooming in on different parts of the image.
"Clearly, this was a great job by the team that installed the seismic sensor,"
he pointed out. Trognor began to sweat a little as his large eye remained fixed on what he was seeing. The sound of the ocean's waters vibrated and made him a bit agitated, reverberating increasingly in his mind with greater intensity, transporting him to another place. A memory of a personal story from his people began to blossom in his mind. Trognor recovered memories that had been lost in a significant traumatic event. Lost Memories of Trognor, Planet Earth, 2,500 years ago. The first ancestors of the Orivshirion family stood atop a mountain contemplating planet Earth. Their ships were attacking the humans, and their victims were running in all directions. All those explosions awakened a behavior akin to lost ants, accompanied by horses and pieces of iron they dared to call swords, but that was far from sufficient. The attacks they endured were terrible. When they tried to defend themselves, they disintegrated into plasma lasers, quickly reducing their bodies to dust and bones. Explosions began to erupt in various places due to the war, and everything started to tremble. The planet awoke in fury at seeing its people being decimated, and now the screams intensified. However, now they came not only from the throats of the humans, but from everyone who was there. Chaos was now fully established in dreadful earthquakes. The leader of the Shirion, Agnicron, placed his hands on his head as he felt the tremor. His companions rushed past him toward their ships. "It's the end!" they screamed, and still amid the shaking, gigantic waves appeared. A large number of humans began to be swallowed up along with those attacking them. Some escaped on a huge boat, where they also placed some of their species of animal inside. Meanwhile, among the Shirion soldiers, they didn't even help each other, while the humans carried those beings who couldn't even think to their shelter. That contrast confused the mind of leader Agnicron. However, what he saw next surprised him the most. Many of his soldiers, upon coming into contact with those waters, melted like slime and mixed homogeneously with what the humans called the sea, their cells being swept away in that vast blue expanse. Despair settled among the invaders, and the war began to come to an end. The mothership retreated amid that whirlwind of troubled emotions.
"How, we being so evolved, did we not have the audacity to know our own planet?"
Agnicron questioned, and a revolution in its geology began. Previously, navigating within their own land was something forbidden, but they broke that taboo. Their region at that time respected that their people originated from beneath the rock, and they should never dare to discover what could be there, for antagonistic was the blue demon they called the sea, and in that war they saw it up close. It was real. Voices then mingled confusingly with those mental images he saw, which gradually began to fade. Still blurry, he could see the computers in that filthy room again. His brother was in front of him, shaking him by the shoulders.
"Are you not listening to me?"
His trance was interrupted. "Damned humans!" He clenched his fists as if recalling a nightmare. Trognar stared back at him, furrowing his brow.
"Pay attention to what I'm saying,"
his voice hissed as he gritted his teeth.
"Don't you think all of this might be too dangerous?"
Then his brother suddenly stood up from his chair, saying in a loud tone,
"The Earth is ours now, Trognar. Step outside and see Agnek's ruthless attacks,"
he said, extending his arms, trying to shake from his mind what he had just remembered. He was referring to the ships that had perfectly defended the mothership for the last 72 hours before launching a counterattack and sweeping the surface of the Earth in a sea of fire. Trognar shot him a fixed glance.
"And do you think the humans are fools like you, Trognar?"
he said, banging on his table and making the keyboard vibrate.
"This victory means little to me. Much can still happen."
Trognar then lowered his arms. Trognar continued.
"The humans, something won't leave my mind, as if a worm is among my neurons to disturb me. Something is not right. I feel we shouldn't celebrate."
And he began to pace back and forth in the room.
"You're going crazy,"
Trognar said.
"I'm not,"
he said, agitation evident in his hands, which trembled slightly. He imagined having his head severed by his emperor's men if he didn't succeed on this mission. Trognar, cold as he was not as strong as his brother, who had lived for a long time, with blood as hot as the flames of the sun. The Shirion, being absolutely military, did not accept useless individuals in the most important body of the nation, where the only permitted exit was death. This was what often happened, so often that nearly all of Trognar's family had met the same fate, leaving him the only one remaining alongside his brother. Furthermore, Trognar's frail body did not allow him to fight. All he had left was to trust in his mind to be valued and stay alive among so many predators of his race. Being the most intelligent, he managed to get this far even without strength, but the humans awakened in him an irrational and difficult-to-handle feeling. He began to doubt whether his intelligence was truly enough now. Trognar watched his brother pace contemplatively back and forth. He felt confused by that excessive worry, unaware of the layers of complexity of the fear Trognar felt. Trognor, unlike Trognar, bore the immense weight of being one of the army commanders and was the main instrument of destruction of the Empire, the strongest in combat throughout all those years. He was the one who saw the blood of enemies gushing before him, unlike his melancholic brother, who only strategized in solitude. However, although he was strong enough to protect himself, it was not enough to protect his brother if something terrible happened due to a decision from an unsatisfied and ruthless Agnek. No matter how strong he was, he couldn't defeat the entire army alone. And even being so strong, he did not own the army. That was Agnek's role, the highest peak of royalty in their nation. Trognar swallowed hard at the thought of that possibility.
It doesn't matter what you think, brother. That doesn't change the fact that the war is over. We've outlasted everyone in recent decades. Why would this time be different? They don't have the strength to continue,
he said, recalling the imprisoned slaves who were currently cleaning the floor for his emperor's soldiers to walk on.
Humans will always be primitive,
he tried to prophesy. Trognar stopped his pacing and fixed him with a narrowed gaze.
Primitive even after all this time? That doesn't add up.
He paused, looking at one of the tangled walls of wires from their numerous computers, understanding it to be a long and seemingly endless ceiling that resembled an inverted abyss.
At least this planet has a valuable resource to be exploited, and it must be done by us before all the other ambitious neighbors. What resource? Trognor asked. The DNA among the species in our solar system is 60% similar. This means that the answers to this substance of hydrogen and oxygen among all could be the same. Now connect the dots. Die because of this damned water? Exactly. Including ourselves, of course. But I have a plan for that.
And his single eye turned slightly to the central monitor at a sinister speed. As he walked again to the supercomputer and pressed a button, numerous images of possible deep-sea predator species appeared, calculated to show what they might look like if their genes were mixed with those of the Ovriv Shirion soldiers by an advanced artificial intelligence. He went through them one by one, a strange gleam of obsession in his eye for what he saw.
First, we will have our own ocean on our planet. Then we will hide in its depths, just like the creatures we are going to visit now after stealing their DNA. I'm sure our rivals, the Virkans, wouldn't like that. And as ambitious as they are, they would never reduce our planet to dust because they dream of exploiting our assets. They would be forced to try to attack us directly. But how, vulnerable to water as they are? If genetic research is successful, this ocean will become our greatest fortress. Our weakness will become our greatest strength, and we will stand out among all the others who will continue to fear the consequences of the sea.
Trognor's eyes widened as he stepped closer to where his brother was.
You always surprise me, brother. I'm amazed that you thought all this up by yourself. Glory to the Oriv Shirian army and our leader, Agnek. Glory to Agnek? Until when will the glory only be for Agnek?
Upon hearing this, Trognor, despite having such a strong appearance, shrank back in embarrassment.
When will you tire of bowing?
After a short silence as an answer, Trognar sat down and crossed his arms.
Speaking of something else, there's something else that bothers me, Trognor. Many things always bother you.
Trognar looked away with a contemplative expression.
It's not pleasant for me that everything sounds too easy. I fear that one of my assumptions might be correct.
Trognor wasn't even listening anymore, and shrugged.
At least it's funny to see the look of despair on humans when they die.
And Trognor suddenly burst into laughter. He laughed continuously, revealing his sadistic side that unconsciously fed a terrible instinct, leading him to continue being a servant of Agnek. Working in his army, he would always find pleasure in destruction. But Trognar had a serious expression and fixed him with a gaze, saying nothing while his brother's laughter echoed on. He then turned his attention back to the computers and monitors, as usual in that dark room, and the sound of his long fingers danced across the curved keyboards. "You will never learn," he spoke about his brother without him being able to hear. Hours passed. The mothership traveled through space, very close to the Earth's atmosphere. It was gigantic, but its lower part, where they were, was small. The higher one went into the kilometer-long compartments, the larger it became. It was like a mountain turned upside down. Trognar stood up from his chair and walked to the door of the room. He placed his hand on an electronic surface, and the door opened vertically. He entered, pressed his hand on another surface on the other side, and a crackling sound echoed. The room he was in began to ascend. Behind him was a large column in the center, but he was in the corner watching the walls descend around him, filled with cybernetic details that served as the skeleton for the many functions of that enormous complex ship. He took pride in having been part of designing those constructions. After a few seconds, the walls disappeared, replaced by a glass that displayed an incredible view of space. He could see not only space, but also its stars and galaxies far away. He had visited most of them, and wondered when he would see them up close again. Below him, the great blue sphere gradually appeared, the intriguing planet Earth, but much of its surface was now gray and lifeless, marked with huge craters as if they were its painful wounds. "Where are the humans?" Trognar wondered to himself, with his eyelid covering half of that contemplative gaze. "I don't think Agnek and his troops have killed them all." His thoughts were interrupted by another snap. He turned his body and saw the door begin to open. A bright light flooded in, and he automatically raised one of his hands to cover his eyes until he got used to it. When he could see clearly, he noticed numerous soldiers of the Empire moving in all directions, busy with their various tasks. He heard their footsteps echoing on the ground amid various informal conversations and some laughter. Some carried large weapons, others examined parts of their ships, while others simply rested. Over those ships there were hundreds on either side of that vast space, accompanied by gates that had identification numbers near each of them, in marked positions where they were supposed to be and prepare for dispatch. He was always impressed by the military organization, even after seeing it so many times. But remembering what he had to do, Trognar crossed that enormous pavilion with quick steps. Eventually, he began to ascend a large staircase, which revealed a space at its last step where he remembered Agnek using it as a stage for various speeches. He looked back and saw from above the enormous size of that base, which was often crowded with proud soldiers listening to him, ready for their wars. He liked the organization of everything, but felt a sense of nausea, and abruptly turned back to the path he was on. In front of him, large horizontal columns closed in on a small corridor that led to a very ornate door. 2 guards stood on each side, holding spears with plasma blades, although their energy was currently being conserved. When they saw it was the one-eyed scientist, they opened the door. Trognar crossed through the door, which closed behind him, leaving him unable to hear anything from the outside. He felt his muscles relax temporarily, but it lasted very little. In front of him stood a tall gray creature, with its back turned and wearing a long red cape over its shoulders. It was gazing at the view of Earth's atmosphere before him. The glass structure was similar to that of the elevator, but now he saw the entire view from a much more privileged angle. The glass was in front of him and curved to the sides, ensuring a spectacular reach of what could be seen from the glorious mothership. Trognar remained silent for a few seconds until he finally mustered the courage to speak. "The data collection squads did a great job.
I have everything I need for the start of the mission, sir.
I'm glad to hear that, Trognar, Agnek replied in a deep but calm voice. He was looking around, slowly, following the curvature of the earth. Trognar glanced at those large fists, remembering how they would clench when Agnek used to get furious. He carefully planned which words to use.
I request permission for the mission squad to disembark.
Are you really sure you are ready to start? Agnek slightly turned his head, glancing at him from the corner of his eye. That gaze pretended to be calm on the outside, but inside, Agnek was judging him with every step. His stomach twisted at the thought of any possibility of failure. Still, he needed to demonstrate confidence. Trognar controlled his breathing.
I am, sir.
And Agnek turned fully to face his subordinate. Unlike Trognar and his brother, he had 3 eyes. The other ordinary soldiers usually had 2. Trognar reflected. Not everything that is newer is guaranteed to be superior. Not every outcome of evolution should be the best version. He didn't like seeing those 3 eyes. You and your brother are among the few who remain from the oldest lineage of our extensive species, Trognar. Much of our technological evolution is owed to you and the accumulated knowledge of your family. Your wisdom is invaluable to me. I permit the mission to commence. Trognar remained contemplative.
Of course, you must be hoping to see me fall,
he thought. Trognar didn't feel flattered to hear those words from his leader. He remembered that none of the lost missions had failed in decades, and that was reflected in the results of conquered planets. But how long would that last? The data said there would be no failures, and all that was left was to continue. Yet he still felt that something didn't add up. He just couldn't formulate what. But it remained continually in his mind, like that tireless worm that wouldn't stop bothering him.
My honor, sir,
he said in a monotonous tone, and exited the room. As preparations for the launch of a new squad began to be implemented, from their pilots and soldiers assigned to protect them to the selection of their weapons in case of unexpected events, the special mission to collect DNA involved going to the deepest part of the ocean, capturing tissue samples from a defined list of predators, and returning. When Trognar arrived at his research center, he saw his brother starting some of his preparations. Now without the black cloak, a characteristic of their family that he usually wore, he was in a special suit designed to endure visibility underwater, complete with a transparent helmet.
Why this face, brother?
He said upon seeing him arrive. Trognar simply went to his chair, focused his eyes on his computer, and did not respond.
Whatever,
Trognar said, heading out for the mission. His brother watched him leave, a tightness in his chest that the logic he trusted so much couldn't explain. He was left alone in that dark room. On the mothership, the movements of the military began to intensify. The ships, now positioned, awaited the authorization for their respective gates to open. Excitement coursed through the soldiers' bodies as they approached a historic moment in their lives and their great nation. They would finally cross the ocean for the first time and experience such terrifying grandeur up close. The gates were finally opened, and the ships began to dispatch one by one from the massive mothership, heading toward the blue planet and breaking through its atmosphere at an incredible speed. They appeared like countless sparks of fire crossing the sky, clustered together among the clouds. Trognar was in one of the ships, the lead one of the entire squad. The others followed behind, and the view of the sea began to appear just below. The sound of the wind outside could be heard beating against the windows. As they finally got very close to the surface, the speed decreased, and they began to glide.
This is good,
Trognar commanded loudly. On his chest was an insignia. The ships then organized themselves, lined up next to each other. After a signal from Trognar with his hands, all began to undergo a sudden modification in their structure, while slowly stopping their gliding and starting to touch the ocean. Their parts moved from one place to another, giving way to a new overall appearance and form. They now resembled sophisticated submarines, moving along the surface while gradually diving deeper in the same direction.
Fascinating,
Trognor said with a wide smile on his face.
From now on, there will be no more limits.
The other soldiers looked out the windows of the submarine with shining eyes as they saw the first surface fish beginning to appear, astonished by something as simple as swimming and living among it, which to them seemed a surprising evolutionary feat. And then, after a few minutes, the silhouette of a fish larger than the others began to emerge from a distance below. From afar, it appeared to be at least 5 meters long. Trognar squinted his eyes, trying to identify what fish it might be. He saw a dorsal fin on its upper body.
A great white shark.
A suffocating silence settled among them all. That intimidating animal passed by the main submarine, slightly approaching one of the windows, as if it wanted to see what was inside or thoroughly examine what that unknown machine could be. Realizing it was far from being a seal or its usual prey, it continued on its way.
Is it really,
he paused for a moment,
that our underwater weapons will be enough, sir?
One of the soldiers asked, struggling to speak without his voice faltering. Trognor, who had been staring ahead, turned and looked at him with a haughty gaze.
There is no defeat for us. Speed up!
And the submarines increased their pace, with the light from the surface gradually becoming more distant. The soldiers tried to hold on even tighter. The numerous submarines traveled deeper in a flawless formation and synchronization, as if they were one body. Their images were displayed on the monitor of a computer in that morbid room, accompanied by a fixed, obsessed gaze that didn't allow itself to blink. Trognar literally tracked every move. A colossal rock emerged in everyone's view. The somewhat suffocating descent that had been going straight down was forced to make a slow turn alongside that submerged mountain, whose size sparked the curious gazes of the travelers.
Could it be the same one?
One of the soldiers said, noticing a silhouette appearing in the distance, coming from the same direction that the unexpected visitor had gone. The blue veil revealed another one beside it, accompanied by another, and then another, revealing what appeared to be a school of fish. And upon noticing this, even though they theoretically knew they were safe behind that metal, they couldn't shake an uncontrollable agitation in their bodies that only grew. They held their weapons with even firmer grasps than minutes before, and every time they looked at those hatches on their sides, their hearts raced faster, incessantly, imagining the moment they would need to be opened.
It's not uncommon for them to travel in groups,
a suddenly electronic voice echoed through the main submarine, without the need for a contact request to be accepted. It was Trognar's voice. His brother, holding his insignia with his fingers, gave a slight jump and grabbed the communicator.
And what difference does that make?
He replied sharply, firing it off all at once. The submarine's lights began to flicker, and a tremor set in, causing everyone to lose their balance slightly. Desperate glances were exchanged among the soldiers, lost in trying to understand what was happening.
Could it be?
The voice said in a tense tone before being interrupted by static, compromising the transmission. The tremor intensified, and then they heard a sudden and deafening noise. A tentacle crossed the submarine, causing its walls and windows to explode, crushing some soldiers who were hit and dying instantly. Water began to gush in from all sides, and the few who remained started to disperse from the submarine, trying to survive the sudden and overwhelming attack. As the tremor intensified, the submerged mountain nearby began to move with a deep sound that reverberated in everyone's ears agonizingly, as if they were being engulfed by an absolute pressure sensation. Instantly, with everyone activating a fight or flight response, that submarine, now in pieces, gave way to direct contact with the vastness of that terrible ocean. The submerged mountain revealed itself to be a gigantic octopus. Trognor and the remaining soldiers, protected by their special suits, watched as the other submarines were attacked in the same way they had suffered. The tentacles crossed over them, crushing or tossing them aside as if they were nothing. The school of fish that had previously been coming toward them now multiplied into many others, and suddenly they were surrounded not only by that colossal aberration, but by sharks that chased them at torpedo-like speeds, biting and hitting their victims and spreading the dark blood of the aliens through the waters of that cruel sea. Now lost in the ocean, they instinctively pointed their weapons and began to fire, even without absolute control of their hands, and even toward directions where some of their comrades were, unaware of it, despite having undergone the most rigorous and categorical training of their lives, unable to function completely amid the terror. Trognor looked around, searching for a submarine that had not yet been torn to pieces, until one finally approached him, and he made every effort to get inside. With heavy breathing as he closed the hatch door, he leaned against the wall, exhaling long sighs. Then he ran to the front and moved to the pilot's side, issuing orders to continue descending at high speed.
"What are you waiting for?"
he shouted with all his might, banging his hands on the control button panel. The pilot beside him, with a twisted expression, was trying hard to think clearly. The soldiers were firing at the enormous octopus with their underwater weapons, but the effects seemed negligible. The only constant they saw was that massive creature continuing to unleash its attacks one after another, causing great explosions underwater.
"How do humans possess something so monstrous?"
one of the soldiers screamed just before his legs were brutally engulfed by a shark that came from the side without him noticing, tearing everything apart with its sharp teeth. Images continued to flicker across Trognar's monitor as he watched the horror unfold.
"It's pointless," he muttered. "The sharks are in much greater numbers. This is extremely rare. It's very strange for there to be so many at once."
He paused, placing one of his fingers over his lips, then suddenly widened his eyes.
"Wait a second. It's as if they're being controlled by someone. The sharks seem to be in perfect sync."
He watched that battle with the sound of everything happening emitted through the speakers of his computer, along with the claustrophobic screams of the Oriv Shirion soldiers who saw no escape. At that moment, he received a transmission from Emperor Agnek, his grave voice drowning out the sounds of the battle in the background.
"Trognar!"
he shouted.
"I trusted you!"
Trognar grabbed the microphone hastily, speaking with trembling lips.
There are so many,"
he replied, his expression contorted.
Gah!
Agnek growled, abruptly cutting off the transmission. Trognar held the silent microphone, breathing heavily with his mouth slightly open. Instinctively and immediately, he rushed to another one of the secondary monitors, frantically typing commands, and some numbers began to appear before him. Available ships, 65. And then the information flashed with a new update. Available ships, 43. Available ships, 21. Trognar clenched his hands on his head.
"Agnek, no!"
Then he looked at another monitor that displayed cameras from the mothership, watching the remaining ships that served as defense being launched into total attack for the mission underwater.
"It's not just with numbers that a war is won, Agnek,"
he shouted, looking at the endless abyss he called the ceiling, his voice echoing between those cold walls, but no one could hear him. Trognor's submarine was one of the few that remained intact and continued to descend through the dark depths. That desperate battlefield was left behind, the agonizing sounds of soldiers fighting against that monster fading into the distance. Alongside Trognor, only 2 other submarines followed with the mission. They were finally beginning to reach the long-desired abyssal depth. The darkness increasingly enveloped the submarines, which seemed so small in that abyss under a veil that appeared almost ghostly, until everything became complete blackness. The only light they had now was from the submarine itself. Externally, everything was so dark they felt lost in a space without even stars or planets, as if it were merely a complete vacuum. But they knew that this was not truly a vast nothingness, for their instincts urged them to use their imaginations to wonder what might be hiding there. And in a space without stars, the first one finally emerged. From a distance, a small blue point could be seen. At first, it was nothing more than an imperceptible dot, and when they noticed it, they attributed it to great luck. "Look over there!" one of the soldiers pointed. The others turned to their window, trying to see that tiny point. "Could it be the anglerfish?" "Who knows? We're getting closer," he noted as the glow intensified. "Lucky for us it's not heading in another direction," he observed. "Why are you still there?" Trugnor said after watching them so curiously. One of them swallowed hard. "Prepare the hatches," Trugnor ordered. Then they all moved to their positions. The pilot began to make a slight turn to finally align in a straight direction toward that small blue point, and its brightness was now becoming so intense that it truly resembled a star, but not a solitary star. More appeared, and more, some with a considerable distance from each other, like distinct points in space. "They're multiplying!" one of the soldiers exclaimed. "Which one should we go to?" "Any one of them. Just go," Trugnor said. As they approached close enough for that glow to be considered at a relatively strong level, the hatches were opened, making a noise to control the water from entering, and they descended. They were now ready to collect the tissue samples. A few dozen soldiers were completely immersed in that abyssal darkness, and the submarine now looked like a house they feared they might not be able to return to. The ocean created a suffocating sensation down there, as immense and gigantic was the pressure, even with their suits prepared for it. But those bioluminescent lights were something very unique to see. It would be a beautiful sight before dying, but now there were no excuses for failure. There was no colossal monster, nor hundreds of sharks to hinder them. They had enough weapons to defend themselves against those predators. At least, that's what they thought. Until one of them was suddenly yanked by the teeth of one that had no light at all. When finally attacked, he remembered to turn on his flashlight as he was being pulled, and what he saw before him was the most terrifying thing he had ever seen. A goblin shark carried him until it ripped his suit and finally tore one of his arms off with its teeth. He felt his blood begin to spread in that aquatic hell. Without noticing what happened to one of the soldiers, the remaining ones rushed even more toward those lights to collect the samples. They wanted to complete the mission quickly and get out of that place as fast as possible. "Why don't we just shoot the capture mechanisms right away?" "We're still too far away. We can't scare them if we miss. We need to ensure our shots are accurate." "And how could I miss, you idiot? I've trained enough," one of the soldiers said, nerves on edge. But their conversation was interrupted by a unique sensation in their lives. Without having realized it before while they were talking, what they saw now around them was as if they were immersed in the middle of a galaxy full of stars. Those luminous points had increased absurdly in just a few seconds. "Impressive! There are so many! Come on, we want to see the anglerfish!" And finally, after getting just a few meters closer to one of those points of light, eager to see for the first time that monstrosity whose DNA they so longed to obtain, which awakened not only fear but also great fascination, their jaws dropped at what they saw before them. The light was not from an anglerfish, nor from any other bioluminescent fish. In fact, they realized that in that place there were strategically no fish at all. In front of them and all around they found themselves surrounded by numerous submarines, but completely different from theirs. "The humans! They're here!" And the gunfire was not coming from the soldiers of Arivshirion, but now from the humans. In a surprise attack, those groups of soldiers that were still remaining were completely demolished. They didn't even have time to breathe. Trugnor watched all of this, dumbfounded, with his hands pressed against the glass of the central platform. He couldn't believe what he was witnessing. Feeling his self-confidence being completely stripped away from him, exploding like one of the last symptoms of a terminal illness. His arrogance in underestimating humans all this time was now costing him a great price. Looking to his side, He saw his pilot's head resting on the control panel. His alien blood oozed and dripped onto the floor. A silenced weapon was in his hands, and a morbid mark was visible on his neck.
The humans are not archaic,
Trognor lamented to himself, with a lifeless gaze, overwhelmed by complete horror. He grabbed his companion's weapon and plunged it into his neck. He pulled the trigger, and the last thing he heard was a muffled sound. The darkness that existed beside him expanded in his field of vision, and his eyes slowly closed. Agnik's ships crossed the atmosphere and passed through the clouds. His fleet transformed completely before entering the ocean. The number of units in that fleet was staggering, like a swarm invading the surface of the sea. In an extremely isolated point on the sea's surface, a long launch ship hid behind a massive glacier. One of the humans on the deck observed the ships that had arrived from a distance, noticing the excessive movements of the invaders. A signal was given with his hand to a pilot who was in position, ready inside a specially designed spacecraft with a remarkably sophisticated architecture.
3, 2, 1, go!
The gravitational impulse engine of that spacecraft was activated, causing euphoria in the central control cabin among those operating the mission. For them, seeing it working officially up close was something spectacular.
Give it everything you've got! Don't hold back!
And why would I hold back? The pilot shouted, now piercing through the clouds, heading towards the sky, faster and with more power than any other rocket known to the public, breaking the sound barrier and crossing the atmosphere in mere seconds. On the gigantic mothership, images of the arrival of that extraordinary counter-attacking ship were transmitted on one of the monitors in that typically solitary room. Trognar agonized within himself, falling to his knees on the cold floor, unable to understand why his end had to come so unjustly.
There is no defense here. Why can't you think, Agnek?
He screamed, still with no one to answer him. The ship collided with the mothership, causing a terrifying explosion. Its complex structure began to collapse into several pieces. Still there in the clouds, with a beach starting to appear in his view, the human descended to parachute after having been ejected minutes before, confident in the automatic control engaged before he exited the spacecraft, with real-time images displayed on his tactical visor. As he fell, he spoke into the microphone lodged in his helmet.
Operation Blue Demon successfully completed.